On behalf of the Drinko Academy, I'd like to say that we are honored to be joined in this celebration by Marshall University's 37th president, Dr. Jerome A. Gilbert, and his wife, Lee Gilbert. We are delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Dr. Gilbert will be starting us off this evening by offering opening remarks and a toast to the great Chief Justice. Mr. President.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight to honor John Marshall. This wonderful evening is coordinated every year by Dr. Alan Gould, who is with us tonight. He's the executive director of our John Deaver Drinko Academy. Thank you, Alan, for everything you do for the Drinko Academy and to remind us of our namesake's legacy. We truly appreciate it. I would also like to recognize Board of Governors members Woody Duba, Mike Sellards, is Mike with us? Cam Brammer, Matt Jarvis, Huntington Mayor Steve Williams, Provost Gail Ormiston, who is going to join us later, Faculty Senate Chair Paige Mueller-Liley, John Marshall scholar and biographer Gene Edward Smith, former Huntington Mayor Gene Dean, former Huntington Mayor Bobby Nelson, and the deans of the colleges. Please join me in recognizing these individuals. I want to say, when I think of John Marshall, I think of the person who shared the story of John Marshall the best, and that's Gene Edward Smith. I want to recognize Gene Edward for his asset to Marshall University. He has been an ally of this university, and we are so proud to have him associated with our university. He is a true jewel to have with us. Gene Edward. It's a great time to be here to celebrate the university and its tie to John Marshall by commemorating his 262nd birthday. And I can tell you that I have a great fondness for John Marshall. Last year at this dinner, I talked about how I had studied a little bit about him and learned so much about the great Chief Justice in just a few months since I'd been president. I said I knew a little bit about him before I came here, but I was gaining a full appreciation of what he had done for our country and through his wisdom in guiding our Supreme Court. Since then, I've taken some steps to try to tie our university stronger to the legacy of John Marshall. This past spring, we took a group of students to Richmond for a series of events to honor his memory. We took our Fife and Drum Corps there, and in addition to having a reception at the historic John Marshall House, we visited the John Marshall High School for a recruiting event. We also did probably the most memorable thing that weekend was we went to Shockoe Cemetery and visited the family gravesite, where we cleaned up the gravesite, we raked leaves, we picked up the trash, and we cleaned the tombstones. And I was looking at the Marshall magazine that has a picture of me with a brush. And I think I'm on Polly's grave. And as you know, the graves back then had what I would call a crypt above them, but the person wasn't buried in that. It was a marker, and underneath in the ground was the body. But we cleaned the Marshall grave sites. We cleaned the tombstones. And our Fife and Drum Corps was with us and did part of that cleanup. And then they played some music in front of the gravesite, which was quite memorable. It was very touching to me, and I think it's something that we want to do every year. I want to thank Wendell Dobbs for his leadership with the Fife and Drum Corps. I swell with pride every time I hear him play. So Wendell, where are you, Wendell? Stand up, Wendell. I also want to mention something that I think is very, very special, and that is here on this campus we commissioned a Hamilton-esque musical named Traditions, The Rise of Marshall, which was performed on this stage for our incoming freshmen as part of the WOW Week. It was written and produced by one of our faculty members, Jesse Nolan of our music department, and I can tell you it was a huge hit. I talked to a lot of freshmen around campus, and they liked it. They said it really resonated with them. They remembered what went on in that production, and they remembered what they had learned in high school about the Constitution and the debate and John Marshall. It resonated with them, and it was so remarkable a production. It told the story of our university. It went on from John Marshall and talked about the founding of Marshall Academy and Old Main and lots of, it went through the plane crash and lots of the significant events about Marshall University. And it was truly a amazing production. I told people that no other university in this country has something like that production, like Tradition. So I'm very grateful for it. I was very impressed with it. It really hit me very hard, and it was made me very proud. And I just want to thank everyone that had something to do with that. The Fife and Drum Corps was in it. So let's give the group that participated and wrote that and did all of the things in Tradition, let's give them a round of applause. Tonight we have with us someone from the era of John Marshall. We have Ben Franklin with us, who is joining us, and I'm looking forward to that. I recently saw an article in The Atlantic where the magazine asked 10 prominent historians. I don't know how they didn't ask Gene Edward Smith, but he wasn't on the list. I think they got that wrong because I think John Marshall would have been a little higher ranked. But anyway, they asked what the 10 most, or the 100 most influential Americans were. And these historians ranked Franklin as number 6 in that list. So number 1 was Abraham Lincoln. Not too surprising, although number 2 I thought should have been number 1, George Washington. Number 3, we would all debate this, was Thomas Jefferson. Number 4 was Franklin Roosevelt, and Alexander Hamilton came in as number 5, which I was pleased to see. And then, of course, Franklin, and then John Marshall was number 7, followed by another truly amazing American, Dr. Martin Luther King at number 8, right behind Marshall, and King were right behind Franklin. So they were very much in good company with Dr. Franklin, who we have here tonight with us. I could talk on and on about John Marshall and what set him apart and what made him worthy of praise, but I won't. But what I will do now is give the official toast. So on each table there are wines, there are American crafted wines and a French sparkling wine. And of the craft wines, the Federalist is a tribute to Dr. Ben Franklin. And of course, he was a tremendous leader in our early days, and he fought for the American cause, not literally, but figuratively, and helped unite us in a nation. The Chardonnay is a Federalist, and it's a tribute to Lady Liberty. There's also John Marshall's favorite Madeira, which we don't have on the table, and we have a limited supply of that. So after the toast, if you would like to have some Madeira, if you'll raise your hand, and they are going to walk around after the toast and serve you Madeira. They're not going to give you a lot because we don't have a lot. But the wine for the toast this evening is a Lemieux sparkling wine from St. Hilaire, and this particular vintage was a favorite of John Marshall's. So if you haven't already popped the cork, and I've heard the corks popping, there goes another one, around, fill your glasses. My wife was hoping that he would hit me, but I know she's got that, she thought that would be funny if he would hit me upside the head. So maybe Dan will give me a glass of champagne and we'll raise a toast here to the Chief Justice. So if you will raise your glasses with me to honor the great Chief Justice, here's to a man underappreciated by many in the world today, a man who was revered in old Virginia and other states as well, a man who loved our Constitution and sought to define it, a man whose friend John Laidley named our university after him. And we toast this man, John Marshall, on this anniversary of his birthday for his name and his legacy, to the great Chief Justice. Hear, hear. Thank you. And raise your hand if you want some Madeira.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilbert, for your toast. And now, shortly, we'll be moving on to our shared meal. On the bill of fare in the program, you will see that we are serving victuals that would have been familiar to John Marshall. And please take note of the dessert. The bread pudding with bourbon sauce, it was Justice Marshall's favorite. So we will proceed now towards the serving of the meal. Our featured performance tonight is one that brings Benjamin Franklin to life. It is a daunting prospect to introduce such a figure. His accomplishments were so substantial and varied. Printer, author, inventor, scientist, politician, and diplomat only begin to outline the fields in which he excelled. His intellect and actions alike inspired many during his life, and to this day, he influenced the political organization of the new United States. He urged unity in times of great upheaval. And he promoted an energetic pursuit of independence in politics and thought, simultaneously practical and idealistic. It is, of course, far better to hear from the source himself than for me to continue. So I give you this evening Poor Richard, Anthony Afterwit, Silence Dogood, the prophet of tolerance, Dr. Benjamin Franklin.
This runaway kid from Boston town had to get away. It was holding him down, leaving family, friends, and indentured too. He knew it was something he had to do. Get away, Ben Franklin. Now, Boston was old, stuck in the past. Philadelphia was new and growing fast. Our pilgrim's progress was swift and sure. His restless disease had found a cure. No time for introspectory, must keep the trajectory. He found a land of promise still unfulfilled, institutions to found, a civilization to build. The canvas was blank for our man Franklin. It soon became clear he was the printer to see if you wanted to define his quality. As if he didn't have enough to do with everything else, he was a writer too. For satire, he had a gift, a regular Jonathan Swift, this Franklin. He was a writing and a printing, everything on a list. With his honey, making money hand over fist, he had reached the height, but it didn't feel right working day and night. Getting rich, there was a hitch. There had to be more. There were worlds to explore, make a discovery. These were boring days. He was in a malaise, needed recovery. Curiosity for natural philosophy, there was a lot to see. More specificity, he saw electricity. Now, success is erratic when you're working with static, but Ben was emphatic. He was ecstatic. Other people would disdain it, but he said, I'll explain it. It works like this. It isn't jumpy or aberrant, it's consistently a current. Yes, it flows. It has a minus and a plus. We can make it work for us when knowledge grows. Then things began to get frightening. He began to study lightning. People said it would be fatal. He said, wait till you see. I can overcome my fright, study at the right height. I'll use a kite to win the fight. And at the right hour, when the proof is in the power you need and cower, you see the light. He said, in case the people doubt it, I'm going to write about it, and if I have to shout it, they'll agree. Well, the upshot of the story is he got the fame and glory from every Whig and Tory across the sea. He became the toast of Britain, and in London he was sitting with everyone who'd written anything. He was dining with the hordes of dukes and earls and lords with honors and awards accompanying. But while our man relaxes back home when there were stamp taxes and everyone had axes to grind. At home he's seen disloyal, suspicious to the royals. Suddenly our man is in a bind. The rioting in Boston, his hopes are getting lost in London, and it's costing him so dear. But enough of all the grieving. He knows he should be leaving, finally believing that it's time. Back home the fires are burning, allegiances are turning. So many now are yearning to be free. So no longer will they bear it, they're frightened, but they'll dare it. It's time now to declare independency. Well, it's one thing to propose it, there's no one to oppose it, and another to suppose it's going to be. The British Army is the strongest, and the Navy has the longest reach of any that belongest on the sea. He knew he needed henchmen, and the Congress brought a Frenchman, hoping they would be the linchpin that we need. Let's send Franklin because he's known there. Let him try to get a loan there, for our cupboards here have grown bare, yes indeed. Now, I'm sure that you've all heard it, so the story's been perverted, and somehow they assured it could be done. I arrived at fame and glory, but that's another story, and surely it would bore us everyone. We won it. It's official. The treaty was initialed and everybody's wish will be fulfilled. So much for the elation. It's time for the creation of a document to get the nation built. And that's how we arrive at the Constitution. And that's my life story in 2 minutes. Take that, Alexander Hamilton. No matter how you feel about modern language and such, it's very efficient. That was very quick, don't you think? Now, you know, if I could get my mouth to work as fast as my brain, I'd be right there. But I think that the aging has set in. First of all, good evening, friends. It is an honor to be among all these distinguished people. Thank you so much for inviting me to visit and speak. I'd like first to thank Dr. Gould for extending that invitation. Yes, please. Your history of service to Marshall is admirable. And I would also like to thank Renee Denny for all she did to take care of the details required to make this possible. Thank you, Renee. This is an important week in the history of our republic. 230 years ago this week, we embarked on a crucial project. This fledgling country had survived so much already. The American colonies had survived years of increasingly unfeeling and often hostile British rule. Finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, making this truly an independent nation. But was it really a nation at all? During our War of Independence, the American colonies, or states as they were now declaring themselves, operated under the Articles of Confederation, of course. Indeed, the government was just that, a confederation of sovereign states or governments. Even after the war, that framework remained. Many states were fearful of a strong central government. They didn't want any outside agency to tell them how to govern. This was certainly an attitude in the spirit of that fight for liberty, but it was also a highly imperfect way to run what many hoped would be a major force on the world stage, many including myself, who'd been around the world a bit. If we wanted to raise revenue, all 13 states had to approve. While I was in Paris in 1785, Robert Morris wrote to me. Morris had agreed to take on the finances of the new nation, a rather thankless job. There were debts to be repaid to France and the Netherlands, funds which had been crucial to our success in the war. Soldiers were owed substantial amounts of money. Morris complained that he had proposed an impost on imported goods that would raise much of the amount needed. One state opposed it, and it went down to defeat. That state was Rhode Island. Little old Rhode Island. There had been many instances of such failed financial measures. Morris and I both knew that if this country was to take its place on the world stage, it had to be seen as a strong nation, not as a deadbeat debtor nation, under danger of an attack by another nation. We must be able to meet obligations at home and abroad. A sufficient number of people saw this need, and in May of 1787, a convention was formed to address reforms of the Articles of Confederation. Of course, this convention quickly became a convention to write a completely new constitution. The question which now loomed was, could 13 disparate, self-obsessed states come to any meaningful agreement? There was every reason to worry about that. Let us see what it took to make that happen. Let us see if these difficulties still face the United States today. Are we, when I say today, I mean your day, of course. I mean, I wasn't there, but I hear things. You know, you'd be surprised when you're Ben Franklin, people tell you everything. And they say, Dr. Franklin, what do you think of our president? What do you think of our government? And I say, I don't know. George Washington is my president. I think he's doing a fine job. Well, actually, I think he'll take office about a week after I die. But are we even now one nation united? And what would help us agree? You know, when I was so concerned about this at the end of the Constitutional Convention that I gave a speech. Actually, I prepared a speech, and I was not feeling too well, and I, the last minute, asked my friend Judge James Wilson to give that speech. But I'm not going to recite the whole speech. But what in being concerned that after all of our secrecy for 4 months of keeping under wraps what we were doing there in Philadelphia so that it would not be attacked and torn apart in the press every day. Does that sound familiar to anybody? We did not want, we wanted people. Now this is maybe a crazy thought for a politician. We wanted people to be able to change their minds. We wanted people to listen. And if they heard something that they hadn't thought of, to maybe say, well, I thought, I said this the other day, but you know, I'm going to change it now. And so I think that was the genius of the Constitution. It is something that doesn't sound right to a lot of people to meet in secrecy like that, but when you think of the fact that it gave us the right to meet and to share ideas, and as I said, to actually listen to one another, I think it was meaningful. But I said, being concerned that when these delegates left and went to their home states and those ratifying conventions, being concerned because of the feelings expressed by many people in the convention, that they would be criticizing the faults of the Constitution so much that it would not be ratified. And I said, I defended the Constitution, and I acknowledged its imperfection. But I said, when you assemble a group of men for their joint wisdom, you also get all of their personal prejudices, their regional interests, their errors of judgment, and from such a group can a perfect product be expected? The answer obviously was no. And so I'm not going to solve that problem today. I'm here with a lot of people who are smarter than I am, more educated than I am, and so I'm not going to pretend to solve anything. First, I'm going to suggest a few things that I've learned that might assist us in becoming more united as a nation, and then I'm going to open the floor to people who might actually know what they're talking about. And anyway, I just have a couple things. First of all, I think education. I mean, I'm speaking to the choir here, right? I'm preaching to the choir. Education is so important, but education in the classroom, of course, in these wonderful, and I'm so impressed with this university. You know, it's not going to be a hidden thing for long. You've got to be careful. One thing that educated me, and I think educates so many people, is travel. It's such a simple thing. So many people, including most of the people I knew in Philadelphia, never leave home in their entire lives. And you get opinions about other people. And when you travel, you actually see other people, and you see why they think a certain way. So I think that's a very simple thing. And another part of that is it's very simple. I don't know why more of us don't do it, but especially men, I guess, is listen. All right. Don't raise your hands, women, please. But listen. The simple matter of listening to one another, rather than going in with opinions. No, I have long felt, I have not been seen or thought of myself as an ideologue. I do not think that's my purpose in any debate, is to be an ideologue. What I like to think of, I believe, and it's not to say that I don't have any goals, but I believe there is a difference between a goal and an agenda. Goals are achievable. Agendas just knock up against each other. And I do honestly believe that that is so important that we not enter, whether it's a constitutional convention or any other thing, with an agenda, a fixed agenda. That's a bit narcissistic, isn't it? And the other thing is a dirty word. I'm sorry, I know you're saying that there are certain words we shouldn't say, but I think I'm talking about something else called compromise. Compromise. Our imperfect Constitution, which has managed to last 230 years, is one big compromise. And somehow it works. Everybody criticizes it. I have people come up to me, Dr. Franklin, what do you think of what these people have done to the Constitution? I said, well, they've kept it. You know, the two geniuses, the genius parts of it, I think, is number one, we made it possible to change it. Number two, we didn't make it so easy to change. I mean, I think most of us thought that we didn't have the answers. That those of us particularly who were engaged in scholarly pursuits, in scientific pursuits, knew that the way we thought about something today is not going to be the way that the next generation thinks about it, or the generation after that, and there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, I acknowledged in that final speech that I was pretty sure that I didn't agree with everything I'd said in the past, and I probably would change my thinking about certain things as time went on. That's about all I've got to say with that, is just making sure that we are open to listening to other people, that we are opening to educating ourselves, allowing us to be educated. And I think even as educators, remembering that education is a two-way process. You've got some smart kids, I'm sure. And I think the best education is when that dialogue takes place, and I suspect in a place like Marshall, with the people you have, the class sizes you have, a lot of that does happen here. And again, you know, just compromise now and then. Don't give up your integrity, but maybe give up your agenda now and then. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And then I'm going to open this up to questions and maybe even comments, other ideas along these subjects. But anyway, Renee, are you back there? Renee has a microphone, and so do I. Renee has a microphone, and if you have a question, please raise your hand, or anything, as I said, anything you want to contribute to this conversation, and someone hopefully will cut us off if we run too long.
Thank Benjamin Franklin would think of our current president.
Well, I'm Benjamin Franklin, and my president is George Washington, and I'm not about to get caught up in such things. One of the luxuries of being extremely retired is that you don't have to address things like that. But sometimes, if you tell me what you think of him and why, maybe I could sort of make that relation to someone else or something, you know.
Dr. Franklin,
yes.
What do you think about General Washington, your president?
General Washington was one of the finest people I ever knew. Thank you. Let me back up. I'm often asked what I thought of certain people that are familiar to people in your time, Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, that sort of people. And I have to explain that, first of all, I did not spend very much time with any of these folks, including George Washington. I was of another generation. I told some people earlier, when I left my business at the age of 42, 1748, George Washington was 16 years old, John Adams was 13 years old, and Thomas Jefferson was 5. And so when I encountered these people in public life, I had already been pretty well known here and around the world for my printing and publishing work and my scientific work. I had met George Washington briefly during the French and Indian War when he was about 23 or 24, I think, in General Braddock's army. I was impressed with him just in that meeting, but I spent 4 wonderful months with him during that summer of 1787 as he presided over the Constitutional Convention. And what I saw was a man of great integrity who kept himself above the fray, did not interject his own opinions, enforced the rules of the convention, and also that and knowing what he had accomplished during our War of Independence, in keeping an army together when there was no possible reason to think that he could. It will later happen when he is president, as far as I know. People tell me these things, that he will keep the country together when there is no rational reason to think that it's going to survive. So I think that he is. Someone gave me a copy of an exchange of letters that we had there. That apparently is our last exchange of letters, and we both expressed this greatest admiration for one another. And when I made out my final will, when I was sailing to France, that's the first time I'd ever been afraid to go across the sea, but I knew there would be British ships and privateers ships in the Atlantic. And I made out a will, and I said to my friend General George Washington, I leave my fine crabtree walking stick with the silver head of the cap of liberty. And I said, were it a scepter, he has merited it. Now that says it. You're welcome. Somebody.
Dr. Franklin,
Oh.
I'm over here.
Oh, you? Yes.
Oh, me.
Yeah.
You are well known as an astute observer of the human condition. And I
All right.
wonder, yes, in our age at least, maybe not in yours, but certainly in ours. And I wonder what advice for personal integrity and behavior you have other than listening and compromise for us.
Well, I suppose that I think just honestly, I made when I was a young man, I was very big with lists. I was trying to become a perfect person, and I was addressing some of the faults that I saw in myself, and I made a list of 12 virtues that I tried to keep, and I kept a little book to keep track of myself. Made little black marks here and there, things like order, cleanliness, all sorts of things, and chastity. I was a young man. I put that down the bottom, but I did, but I got so impressed with myself and how well I was doing. Remember, I was the one keeping score. That I apparently got a little bit insufferable, and an old Quaker gentleman came to me and said, "Franklin, may I suggest to thee a 13th virtue?" And I said, "Yes, certainly. What is that? How have I missed one?" He said, "Humility." And I acknowledge that's the hardest one for me. So I'm not sure I'm anyone to give advice on that, but I do think honestly that I believe very strongly that people ask me my religious beliefs, and I have stated very succinctly that I believe in a creator of the universe who looks after us with his benevolence, and he ought to be worshiped and served. And the best service to him is service to our fellow man. So I believe that doing whatever we can to serve our fellow creatures is by far the best thing that we can do. No, thank you.
Dr. Franklin, I've read of you being described as in 1770 the world's most admired Englishman. What made
Really?
at least one of the most admired
Not by the
Englishmen in
Englishman.
the world? What made such a person become a revolutionary?
That's a good question. I had always been a loyal subject of the British king. I had written at times that I felt that the British government was the finest form of government that had existed on the earth, and I believe it was at that time. But I also had begun as early as the 1750s to feel very strongly and advocate that we should be loyal to the king, be a viable part of the British Empire, but I felt that we were going to be the most populous part of the British Empire, which would happen, that we were obviously had this vast store of resources, and I said that we should not be ruled by the whims of Parliament, but by our own local assemblies. And so in other words, basically I felt that I was very comfortable being a part of the British Empire, but with home rule. And as I said, 20 years later, I saw that was not going to happen, even after some encouragement in certain quarters. But things got so intolerable that, again, it was obvious to me that it was not going to happen, and that I had angered them in many ways, and they had angered me, and so there was no one thing. There were certain things like the period in which they hauled me into the Privy Council of Parliament and excoriated me, and that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. But I knew what I knew also was by that time America had changed. It had grown. And I felt that it was. I tell students sometimes that I speak to that it's sort of like I said. I felt that we had grown up as a country, and as much as we loved our mother, England, we no longer needed. It's time to leave home, and there comes a time. And I said, it doesn't mean we hate our mother. And I did not hate the British people, but I felt it was time that we be on our own. And so it was a combination of things like that. Yes, sir. Oh, somebody else?
Yeah, over here.
Who's up? Oh, over there.
Yeah, so,
It's coming from behind me. You have to understand.
sorry about that. I seem to remember from your autobiography that you were an indentured servant.
I was indentured to my own brother.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what do you think of the rights of minorities and immigrants and women and the oppressed among us to fight for their liberty?
Well, I think everyone has a right to liberty. And I say this as someone who did not always behave in that manner. There was a period in which I actually owned a couple of people. I say owned, no one owns another human being. I do believe that they all have a right. I said, I believe that, and as I felt in my conversion, if you will, about the concept of slavery, I feel the same way about all of these other things. As long as you look at certain people as something other than yourself, then you can feel one way about them. When you finally acknowledge that we're all alike, you can't do that anymore. And that's honestly the way I feel.
Thank you.
How does it feel to be struck by lightning?
That is a misconception. I was never struck by lightning. It was a very carefully conceived experiment. I was out of the way of the lightning. That's why I had the kite. I did knock myself out trying to kill a turkey with electricity. It was a friend of mine and I were going to, it was Christmas dinner. We thought we could kill this turkey with electricity and maybe even cook it with electricity. And Well, as much caution as I used with that electricity, with that lightning, I picked up a wire that I shouldn't have. My friends told me that there was a loud crack and a bright flash. I don't remember any of this, and that I was out for a couple of minutes. And I like to say that I tried to kill the turkey and I almost cooked my goose. Wendell.
Dr. Franklin, we are very concerned about these reports of instability in France.
Really?
Yes, upon your return from France, can you fill us in on what the nature is?
Well, I think there's a very simple answer to that. There is a great divide between the ruling class and the others, and well, the poor, the dispossessed, and everyone who's not a member of the aristocracy. John.
Who are these people?
Oh, the rabble, you know. But Thomas Jefferson. Can I say that here? In 1789, as I will be near my end, Thomas Jefferson came home from Paris to tell me about the fall of the Bastille. And again, not only was it a very unstable situation, these two monarchs were probably some of the worst candidates to hold a country together. They were, in many ways, they were children. Louis and Marie, I think he probably was trying his best. I think she was infatuated with being a princess and a queen. And so I think, honestly, it was a combination, as far as I know. Again, I'm sure there are people here who know more about that than I do. There's our history professors over here. But I honestly think that it was, in my own mind, it was a combination of an unsustainable population, government situation, and very young, inexperienced monarchs. So, and you know, I think the case when you get situations like that, I suspect they got a lot of the wrong people advising them. Yeah, but I don't know. That's all I know about it.
Dr. Franklin,
Yes, sir.
how was it like to work with John Adams when you were trying to receive some aid from the French?
Well, I didn't mind. I guess he was a little upset. It was a little annoying. You know what the thing was with Mr. Adams? We didn't disagree on very much, but I suppose in that case it was very much of what you would call a style and substance sort of thing. Mr. Adams was a Bostonian. Now, I had been a Bostonian, but I was I had left there at a young age, and he had a very definite way of looking at things. For example, let me tell you, he was very meticulous about his French. He spoke very good French. He went to Harvard. I went to the second grade, and I taught myself French from a book. I spoke terrible French. He dressed perfectly for court. I dressed in an old brown linen suit and my fur hat that I had gotten in Canada, and I was trying to make a point. I was creating an image of Americans for the French. What bothered him was that people liked me better. I did everything wrong, he did everything right, and they liked me better. He didn't approve of my lifestyle. He didn't approve of my being out late at night. What happened, he said, to early to bed and early to rise? And I said, well, you know, I was poor then. But no, he did. I understood that the French, you were not going to find a Frenchman to do business with at 10 o'clock in the morning. And whatever happened, whatever worked, what I do credit him with, I was not very good at the business of running a committee, and our affairs were in a bit of a mess when he arrived. The office was in a bit of disorder. He was very good about putting that together. He was very strong on certain things. John Adams is a man that I admire, always admired greatly. Although we had our differences, he is a man that we could not have done what we did in 1776 to 1783 without John Adams. His passion, his his determination, his belief in the cause of independence, and the other thing about Adams was, one reason the British didn't like him was I think he knew more about the English Constitution than they did, honestly. And so I will not speak ill of John Adams. Yes, sir. No, you don't. Am I on trial here, sir? I have not heard too many rumors about Britain, but all right. Well, the question is, did those rumors originate in my time or yours? Is one of the questions, and number two is France. This whole thing about France. First of all, I was a widower. I mean, you know, I was 71 when I arrived there. I was nearly 80 when I left, and not to insult any people like myself who are of that age, or those ages, but you know, I'm flattered at the accusations. As I heard someone say, I deny both the allegation and the alligator. Yes.
Dr.
Anybody
Franklin.
else?
What do you say?
Well, all I can say is, read my almanac. Anybody else?
Dr. Franklin, serious question. How were you at Coits?
I never was much taken with Coits, and I am amazed at the Coit culture here. I have never seen anything quite like it.
If you're back on the 26th, you can play with us.
Oh boy, okay. I mean, I've been known to toss a few of those for the children and such, but I had not seen it. I guess I'd not encountered it on the professional level. All right.
Dr. Franklin,
Yes.
which philosophers helped influence the Constitution?
Oh goodness, there were many lawyers. I'm sorry, who put lawyers out there? There were many philosophers who influenced it. Of course, people like obviously in the English tradition, like Locke and Hobbes and such. Kant. I think that probably it's hard to say. I personally, in my own thinking, was influenced by people like Pythagoras and others who were a bit of a more humanitarian bent than some of the more, I guess you'd say, hard-nosed English philosophers. I think philosophy. I don't see that the imprint of philosophy as much on the Constitution, except some of the political philosophy, of course. But certainly, despite denials, probably the English Constitution probably had a little bit of influence on it. Certainly, it's some of the proposed things from certain people. But it was, as I said, it was very diverse. So I don't know much more than that. I know I wasn't thinking particularly about philosophers too much when I was addressing it. I was honestly thinking about, as a newspaper man, I was thinking about deadlines. I said, we got to get something out there before we die. Yes.
In the Declaration of Independence, which is basically a list of complaints.
Yes. I call it our breakup letter. Yes.
What we mainly remember today is taxation without representation, but that is well down the list.
Yes.
If we
Well, there were things like quartering troops in our homes, burning our towns. Of course, much of the impetus for a lot of that came from New England. Much of the country was not on board with all of the furor for independence yet, but most places had not had British troops in the street for so many years as Boston had, for example. But taxation without representation was one thing. I mean, most of us really knew that taxation in some form or other was inevitable in some way. The British were taxed. Also things like the fact that the restrictions on our manufacture being at the mercy of the British for imports and such. I mean, there was a long list of things. Jefferson accused King George III of stirring up the slave trade. I'm not sure that was true, but and who's he to talk, really? But I think that it was more, as you said, it was basically a laundry list. Yeah.
Dr. Franklin,
Yes.
could you please address the influence that Freemasonry had on the creation of the Constitution?
Well, Freemasonry on the Constitution. Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly on, I don't have a lot to say about that. I'm not sure what, other than the fact that Freemasonry for me was a way of, as a young man without a lot of wealth, being able to enjoy the avenues to other people that the gentlemen's clubs of the wealthy offered. I don't know. I'd like to hear what you think about that. Maybe you've thought more about the influence of Freemasonry on the Constitution than I have. Well, what? I know you're a Mason. What do you? As I said, this can be an exchange. I'll defer to you on that. I think you know more about that.
You're much smarter than I am.
Oh, yes, right.
But, I think it
You
had an
outrank
impact.
me.
I don't know about that either. I don't have an autobiography.
I never finished it either.
But I think perhaps among those that signed the Constitution, I think the majority, by far, were Freemasons.
Oh, certainly there were many Masons there, and also who signed the Declaration of Independence, or signed it, or were, as General Washington was an original member of the Second Continental Congress. Yeah.
Were you affiliated with a lodge in
I was the
Philadelphia?
the first Grand Master of the Pennsylvania Lodge.
One other question, separate from that. Could you please address the issue, you and I talked about this earlier, of your relationship with your son, William, and why you could never reconcile with him?
Yes, this could go on a long time, and I won't do that. But the fact that when my son and I split over the issue of the war, we had been very close for all of his life, and when we split over the issue of the war, I had been a British official myself, and I had gotten him, I'd done a lot to help get him that position as the Royal Governor of New Jersey. When he refused to join our cause, and I do believe he had aspirations for a position of aristocracy at some point, and knew that that wasn't going to happen in this republic. But to tell you the truth, over the years, a man has time to think about these things. I feel very strongly that many people just out of pocket just see it as a political split. It wasn't more than a political split. It was a personal split. I was a father and my son had chosen to go against his father, and honestly, it was stubbornness and an insult. I felt insulted, And the longer it goes on, the less I am able to defend that. I believe it's a tragedy for a father and son to be estranged. And I honestly think, the more that I think about it, I could defend it by saying it was a political thing, but it was a personal affront, is the way I saw it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Good evening, Dr. Franklin.
Yes.
On to very serious issues here. I believe the wild turkey, which are abundant in West Virginia, is a very bold and noble and beautiful bird.
I believe
Can
the same.
you speak to the bad moral character of the bald eagle, and would you suggest we take on a campaign to change the national symbol?
No, I will not take it on a campaign. I have never, despite what I've heard people tell me to the contrary, I never said we should take on a campaign for the wild turkey. This all started, and I believe you can only find one reference to this. It is in a letter that my daughter wrote to me at the end of the war. I was in France. General Washington and some of his fellow officers had formed a society called the Society of the Cincinnati, named after the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was a great example to Washington as someone who had won major battles and was offered everything and walked away back to his farm, as Washington did repeatedly. And my daughter sent me a newspaper clipping about that, and in that clipping there was a crudely drawn picture of an eagle. At least they said it was an eagle, and as would be the symbol of the new Society of the Cincinnati, not the symbol of the United States. And I wrote back to her that I thought it looked more like a turkey, and I said I think a turkey would be a better symbol since it's a native bird, and the eagle is a bad moral character, being a bird of prey. And so that's all I said. And you know, if you take half of what I wrote seriously, remember I was I published almanacs and satires and everything else, but seriously, I said that the eagle was, the turkey was a Native American bird, and that was my justification. But again, I was addressing the issue of the mascot, if you will, of the Society of the Cincinnati, not of the American Republic. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Franklin. If you could come up here, please, sir. We have a couple of gifts for you. It was a wonderful presentation. First of all, you'll find in this bag here, if you can lift that bag, there are 3 bottles for you to enjoy this evening in your hotel.
Oh, my. Oh, well, I got to get up in the morning. You really want me to address your students tomorrow?
Yes, you will be addressing the
All right,
history
wonderful.
students in the morning. But there's a bottle of Madeira, and there's both the red and the white Federalist wines.
Oh,
and you have, of
well,
course,
they're-
the President's office and John Smith to thank for that gift.
John, first of all, John, I did taste the Federalist Cabernet. Excellent choice. Thank you.
We also have a
Oh,
couple
no,
of
this
gifts
is-
here.
Did you give me a suitcase too?
No, we'll take care of that in the morning. We're a full-service
All
operation.
right, very well.
So we'd like to thank you very much for your very interesting and stimulating presentation, and we look forward to your visit, to your next visit to Marshall.
Oh, thank you.
When we expect
I would
you
be
to
honored.
compete in the quiz.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Franklin. Before Dr. Gilbert offers his closing words, I would like to briefly acknowledge the creative and professional work of James Morris Smith, Deborah Carden-Deem, and Kevin Bannon, who collectively are responsible for the elegant decorations and sound that we have enjoyed this evening. So a round of applause for our wonderful staff here. And then one final note before I pass this on to the President. Lastly, the person most responsible for all of this, for organizing, orchestrating not only tonight's dinner, but all the events that the Drinko Academy holds over the course of the year, is Renee Denny. As you know, Renee works in the president's office, and she also helps out in the Drinko Academy. She is a consummate professional, a credit to the president's office as well as to the Drinko Academy, and one of the hardest working acts in show business. So thank you very much for all of your attention this evening. Thank you, Renee. You've just been great to work with. President Gilbert, please.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Franklin and his colleagues. I think we sometimes don't appreciate the hat that he's wearing. We are Marshall. I had the pleasure last week of addressing the community about civic responsibility. And one of the things that I said at that talk was that sometimes we try to apply today's standards to the individuals like Dr. Franklin and John Marshall and others who were at the founding of this country and who did a remarkable job in creating a constitution that has sustained the test of time. And I want to thank Dr. Franklin and his colleagues for what they did in setting us up as a country that will survive for many, many generations to come. Thank you, Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin didn't really know John Marshall very well. He was probably 40, 50 years older, is that right? Probably. They met at the Constitutional Convention, but that may have been the only time that they crossed paths. Certainly, he was a young man, that is, Marshall was a young man at the time, and certainly we owe a lot to Dr. Franklin, but we owe a tremendous debt to John Marshall, and I firmly believe that John Marshall's memory and that all he represents will continue to be preserved at our university and by all of those who have come to know the genius of John Marshall.